This is Trans-Africa Radio.
It might sound like a can of Coca-Cola, but 340ml is a wonderful group. And of course, they got you wonderful songs like Midnight Driving. They come through with the song DJ Shimza and Q-Bar with I'll Be Back on #Man Talk Saturdays, taking us to just 18 minutes before the hour of 7 p.m. Central African time. It is news, views, reviews, and interviews and everything you've come to expect to this side of the equator. Today in the studio, I've got a guest that is going to give us an education par excellence. His name is Mr. Phill Mashabane. He comes through into the studio as an architect. Good afternoon, Phil.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
I'm excellent.
Can you just please pull the microphone closer to you?
There's a huge difference between an architect, architecture, and the person who builds the building. Those are three elements that contribute largely onto the built environment. There are also aspects that come into built environment like law and administration thereof, which would be project management.
Yes.
Right. So, speaking about an architect is a person who would stipulate or speculate largely.
Speculate.
Yes. Right? Architecture is a science that governs the lives of people. It's not necessarily about structures. It's not necessarily about buildings. It could be about a place, a sense of place, and a memory in a particular place that which people subscribe to. Right? And then you've got to get the person who builds the building. Now, the contribution thereof comes from various people. It's a person who lays the bricks and etc. But of course, they need to have a particular background or training or skills which are requisite with the building.
Yes.
It's firstly to understand what is intended.
Okay.
And apply their expertise. Many years ago, I used to work for one practice. And when we designed buildings, we had, call it an in-house or a reference builder who was used largely on the project that we did.
Okay.
At the time when we conceptualized the project, I would consult the builder because there's a challenge where an architect would conceptualize a solution which is not necessarily buildable.
Okay.
And therefore you've got to consult those who can see beyond your thinking and make it possible to advise you that your solution is the best. It looks great, but it's going to cost a lot of money. But we can give you a solution that which would still achieve your look and feel, but it would be far cheaper. Then you speak to a good builder then.
It seems like a very complex and technical branch of science because, you're dealing with not only the composition of the materials and wherever you are, so the sand and all of that, but you also have to deal with the vision of either the client or the solution that you've devised. Yep. So, we get buildings who are extraordinary shapes. I look at things like the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, look at the London Eye, very tall, and all those buildings that look, like they're something out of make-believe.
Right.
How much of it is an art and how much of it is a science?
Now, that's a good question. When it's speculated, and it cannot be built.
Yes.
It becomes a piece of art. Right? Now you need to look beyond that. As soon as you've conceptualized that piece of art, then you need to bring in the anthropology and the sociology that which would make it withstand the test of time.
Sure.
And what is that? You need to begin to assume and engage with the cultures of the end users. Then it becomes architecture in that way. Otherwise, if it cannot be bought in by the people in the community or the people who would end up using the building or the place itself, it would have no meaning.
Yes.
Right.
Interestingly enough, I used to work for a law firm for my sins, and while I was in the building, a competitor law firm had come through to the adjacent plot to say they want to build a law firm right there. They want to move their headquarters to that area. And they had, spoken about, the height of the building has to eclipse the existing building that I was staying in, and the amount of money that needs to be spent on it, the finishings, the marble, etc., etc. When you're an architect, how do you get the buy-in from another client to say, listen, the guys across the road have 15 stories, I can give you 17 for, a fraction of the cost?
You've actually alluded to what is called the identity in terms of a building one surpassing the other one by only one story.
Yeah.
And there are a number of buildings. That was a competition largely on buildings in Hong Kong.
Okay.
In fact, in Shanghai, where all the buildings, when they were equal in height, but the competition is that who's got the tallest building, the one would put only a spike,
Yes.
a radio spike. Then it's part of the building, and then it's taller, right? Now, with the kind of clients that you just mentioned, like lawyers, it's about their integrity, their image. The bigger, it is deemed to be making available more resources than the smaller practice.
Yes.
And of course, in nature, it does happen that way, because the more space you have, the more people will bring in with different expertise. However, you're talking about lawyers. They occupy commercial buildings. And you see in our cities, that's why they spring up like mushroom. It's about the designer and the developer selling prime space.
Yes.
And commercial space. It's not necessarily architecture.
When we speak about prime space, I mean, you look at addresses like number 1 Santon Drive, number 1 Rivonia Drive.
Correct.
How much of that is part of the selling point? Because, you know, it's said that you no longer buy the building, you buy the address.
Right. It's a good address in the good neighborhood.
Yes.
Number 1 Van Vuren Street in Roodepoort would have no meaning to anyone else.
Nope.
But this is Santon.
Number
This
1
is
Santon
Rivonia.
Drive.
Exactly. The Santon, the baby to Johannesburg. You know, as well as you know, that Santon is a few years old. It just grew up when all the big businesses moved out of CBD of Johannesburg and re-established themselves in a farm.
A square mile farm.
Exactly, that was a square mile farm, and which has become a city on its own.
And now they have over 90,000 cars driving in every single day.
Absolutely.
Ridiculous. But let's talk about you a bit more, Phil. I mean,
Right.
you've obtained your degree from Paris. So
Yes.
you were telling me you stayed in France for 15 years.
Yes.
You actually studied in French.
I studied in French.
So-
I studied my architectural degree in French. I studied my law degree in French.
Okay. So let's just talk about that for a second. Why did you need to leave the continent to go study in France? Is that sort of the district where, I mean, for instance, if you're looking for high-end fashion, and I use this in inverted commas, you go to Milan, you go to Italy. Is architecture the prelature of the French?
Well,
or?
at first, it was not a need. I was immature. It was out of curiosity.
Okay.
My brother already then, and my sister, they lived in Paris, and my sister in Marseille. And I was just curious just to follow and exactly understand why are they there, right? But then I didn't just go straight to Paris. I lived in London and studied at South Bank Polytechnic.
Okay.
My brother then was a doctor of law in Paris, in London, but not yet recognized by the West because he studied in Poland. So qualifications from the East were not recognized by the West.
Okay.
And he had to go to the British country to get his qualifications ratified and be accepted. And then he was accepted as a lawyer. But then at that stage, when I joined him, then I joined the School of Architecture.
What fascinated you about architecture? I mean, when you look at an 18-year-old Phil and he's just finished high school and he has to go out and look at what he's going to do with his time. Architecture is quite a sexy degree, isn't it?
It's not really sexy.
It has the right sound, and everyone looks at buildings and says, I mean, I know my parents would say to me, be an architect, be a doctor, be a lawyer, be an accountant. Those were seen as the premium degrees. What for you drew you into architecture?
Well, not giving away my age, at that stage, architecture was not sexy.
Oh.
It was one complex engagement. It's an engagement with society. It's not necessarily a career. It tends to be a craft because you begin to engage with people and engage with spaces that make people who they are. So I was not much inspired by the deemed to be glossy appearance of architecture. Even today, it's the worst it's the worst career. It's the worst profession. You don't get paid. You've got to fight for your fees and etc. Your fees are cut down left, right to center because no one has found value to understand first what is architecture, what it does in the human life.
Yeah.
Right. Similarly, with the structures that begin to determine the values of careers, they never understand architecture, so they comment less about it.
Yeah.
Hence, if I was to move a little forward and touch on the Pan-African Architecture Awards,
Yes.
it is because of that reason that it needs to be brought to the attention of people through competitions and etc. But back to Phil again.
Yes.
Right.
Please, Phil.
I usually don't speak about myself because I'd like to hear people speaking about me.
Well, I mean,
the people whose lives I've touched, those are the ones who speak about me. I speak less about myself. However, having studied in Paris and came back to South Africa and continued and wanted to be employed, in fact, in the field of architecture, but there were huge restrictions of the Job Reservation Act,
yes,
right, which prevented me to practice or to work as an architect. And out of frustration, but the frustration led me to identify an error on a design which was being presented when I was placed in a printing room to print drawings. They didn't know what my background was. Right.
So you're just printing drawings. No one knows that you're trained in architecture,
yes.
And you see an error in the documents
and when I started
printing.
making written comments on this in a red pen, my senior came to me. He was very furious.
Why have you defiled my drawings?
Exactly. I said, look, I do apologize, and I said, but this cannot be built. It will never be built. And he wanted to know why, and I told him about the calculations which were incorrect.
Okay.
I said, it's just a pretty picture, but it won't be able to be built. And that information and discussion was passed on to the resident engineer, who, of course, when he interviewed me about, firstly, the complaint that had been lodged.
About you defiling the documents.
Exactly. And he understood that I'm a trained architect. I was a trained engineer. And I understood exactly. And he agreed with me. And at that moment, he offered me a position in his department.
Oh, wow.
But I said, thank you. That's when I left.
You've been offered a job after you find an error in documentation that is way above your pay grade, and you're offered a job and you don't take it on. Why not?
Because if I took that position, there would have been a lot of unnecessary expectation from me to prove myself unnecessarily, not necessarily to do my work.
Yeah.
So I decided, out of principle, they knew that when I didn't apply for a job, in fact. I was referred. I was a referral to that department. And they should have known better that what background did I know, right? But when they placed me in the printing room, I thought call it a probation period. But probation period close to 2 years, and I realized. And of course, when your probation is extended to 2 years, you need to be worried.
Yes.
But I wasn't worried because I needed to understand exactly how do they operate, how do their minds work, right? But when I quit same day. And I packed my bags. A week later, I was on my way back to Paris.
For me, the idea of apprenticeship is so amazing because you're talking about being in probation, and someone else can see it as apprenticeship because you were learning sort of I'll use the word again loosely, the not so glamorous part of the work. You weren't doing the drawings, you were doing the mundane labor. And yet you got to understand so many things while you were in there. Are you finding that part of the reason why the field of architecture isn't growing, in my opinion, or given the light it needs to and the prominence it needs to, is because people don't understand that as much as it's a science, you go to engineering school, you can go to architecture school, that a lot of it also comes into the craftsmanship, learning from people who know better than you and understanding the nuances about what can and cannot be built, because, again, you're working from images that are yet to be built.
Yeah. Well, you touched on internship. Internship is also a complex podium or process because those who are seeking internship, they are not necessarily geared up to be trained. They are only filling the gap, which is a requirement partly of their other qualification or job requirements, right? But taking a few steps back again, when I started working in Paris, the practice that advertised for work, it was seeking people with 10 years experience post their professional registration. And what does it mean? You'd spend your 6 years in architecture, studying architecture, right? And you've got to do your 2 years in preparation for your professional registration, right? And then plus another 10 years.
So you're 16 years in the industry.
So they are looking for somebody with at least 16 years from the moment he started his career, right? And what did I do? The practice that had advertised for work or for employment was my ideal practice, that which was doing competition work in Paris.
Yeah.
And I simply sent a letter, not responding to the advert, but offering my services for no pay. And in return, I wanted them to train me for 6 months in their skills of how they manage competitions.
Wow.
Right? And which employer can refuse that?
I mean, it's hands on deck for no fee at all.
Of course. Then I was brought on board. But then in my submission to them that I'd only like to be with them only for 6 months because I had another plan. There's another practice that I wanted to join 6 months thereafter.
Okay.
Now, to me, that is intentional. I was building my skills.
Yes.
Because I could not meet any requirements of any advert.
Well, not
Right.
16 years.
Exactly. Right. So lo and behold, they brought me on board. And same day they asked me, that was the first question. What is your plan for the day? My interview was in the morning. I said I had dedicated my day to be here. I didn't say, I still have got to go and do some shopping. I've got a doctor's appointment and etc.
Need to go
I said,
buy
"I'm
the
here."
shams.
They said, okay, you'll speak to Mr. Behold. He will give you guidance which project you need to be involved in.
Wow.
I started on the same day. But remember, I put myself forward as I didn't require any payment.
Yes.
And they asked me a question at the interview, then how are you going to survive? I said, look, I'm not poor.
I'm okay.
I'm okay. I've got financial resources that can sustain me. They said, how? I said, my brother is a doctor of law. I do his research. In preparing for his cases, he pays me. A month later, then I was called into a meeting wherein I thought they would give me marching orders and tell me how useless I've been. But in that month, I interacted with everyone else and engaged in the projects that they were involved in. I gave my views and opinion wherever it was necessary. And when I was called into this management meeting, they simply said to me, we'd like to thank you for the participation in assisting in resolving the number of problems which they had. Would you accept if we pay you your out-of-pocket expenses? I said, thank you very much.
Right.
Acceptable.
Thank you very much. I'll take it. A couple of euro.
2 months later, then I was called into another management meeting, and I thought, oh, for goodness sake, there's something wrong that I've done.
Every other month, Phil.
Yeah. And then they offered me a permanent position.
Oh, wow.
Now, against the 10 years that they were looking for in terms of experience.
Which was 16 years in real terms.
I'd proven myself within 3 months. Similarly, when I employ people at my office, I look into them. You know, some of them, particularly who are seeking internship, it is not them who write to us as employers. It is their parents. And I ask the parents, why you are taking that step for your child?
As opposed to him doing it himself.
Of course. And of course, I was guarding against an error which I've done myself, wherein when my daughter said she wants to be a CEO and be groomed as a CEO, so I told her that the CEO is in my life. It's people who've got a qualification in BCom and in law, and both even better. And I introduced her to a friend of mine who started actually one of the radio stations in South Africa, who came from Texas, who was then, before he came to South Africa, he was an attorney general. But he quit law because law is a social program. It's like a reed. The only thing that stays is the opinion that would be supported.
Yes.
In law. And then it creates a precedent.
The majority judgment.
Exactly. Right. So when I encouraged her to study law, and of course she went to Phill University, but she dropped out and etc.
Well, I mean, she went to a great university. I myself am alumni of...
Yes. She dropped out because she found law boring. That was my biggest mistake. And today she's a horticulturist. She says, I want to be a landscape architect like you did. So these are the errors that we make as parents.
Yeah.
We tend to channel our children where we think. And of course, parents are never wrong. But as I came in here, you raised the question about my son. You think that he's going to be an architect? No, he may not be. I'd leave it to him. He may want to come and work at a radio station. Who cares? Come
through. Come along. you have a nice time on this side. I mean, for me, it is so interesting, Phil, because and I think we could have a conversation for 5 hours then because of your of your illustrious career, 30 years in the industry plus. Yeah. You studied, so just to wrap that up, in Paris.
Yeah.
You've extensively worked in Paris. You've studied in Paris. You have an LLB degree as well.
I've got an advanced certificate in ADR, which is Alternative
Dispute Resolution.
From the University of Pretoria. I've got a Master of Science in Knowledge and Project Management from Salford University in Manchester.
I mean, for someone who's so incredibly decorated, and the work that you've done, and I mean, also you've got Mashabane Rose.
Not necessarily decorated, burdened.
Burdened, not decorated. I'll use that one next time. In Africa, do we have those icons of architecture ourselves. You know, we always have this interplay between what's African and what's cosmopolitan. In the same way that we have our natural resources that are transported somewhere else and then brought back to us for 100% markup, diamonds, whether it's oil, raw materials. Yet it does seem that we do have a void in having those iconic structures of architectural integrity. The same thing I asked when you came in was, you know, what do you think of a particular building in Sandton? And because opinions has been raised that it's a scar on the face of Sandton, because I was struggling to find buildings in this continent that I can say that's something that stands out as an architectural masterpiece.
Look, there are many buildings in Africa. It's only that Africans, humble as they are, they never show off their quality of work and quality of life, right? Now, the buildings in Europe and etc., those are commercial buildings, and of course, and African buildings and buildings in Africa, of course, they need to take into consideration, as I mentioned earlier, the anthropology and the sociology around the place where the building is going to be built. So it becomes a very complex process. And of course, Africa, it's a different climatic environment than Europe.
True.
Europe, you're talking about glass buildings and etc. It's an era, for example, even in Africa, to put up a glass building.
Yeah.
Of course, you've got to gate up with so much mechanical cooling systems and etc. And of course, the new age of architecture, or the green buildings, Africa is beginning to move away from all those mechanical things. We're trying to get the buildings to cool themselves.
Yes.
And of course, it depends on the materials that are used and the orientation of the buildings. It's very significant.
This is the first ever dedicated Pan-African Awards, now open for entries and offers a $US prize of $10,000 to the Grand Prix winner. It's launched by the founder Saint Gobain and who support the development of sub-Saharan Africa. The awards recognize worthy projects from across the African continent and also encourage emerging talent. So it is the importance of architecture for both economic growth and identity development cannot be overemphasized. From the urban renewal and regeneration to environmental impact control, technical innovation and infrastructure development, and to express the continent's true identity. And that's what my hashtag Mantalk guest is talking to be about in the studio. His name is Phill Mashabane. He is an architect and of course he is also the founder of Mashabane Rose Incorporated, an architecture firm. Phill, so we're talking about, how I've now understood through our conversation that some of the reasons why we see and remember some of the buildings abroad that have become iconic is because, as you were saying, there is a social and anthropological element to it. As you were saying that the Cathedral of Notre Dame it was a church, and during the Bastille Day celebrations and when actual Bastille Day took place, it had to be integral to it.
The Pan-Africa Architecture Awards, as you've earlier mentioned, that it was founded as, and of course it's intended to be the catalyst program to enlighten. It's not only to bring on board the up and coming or emerging architects or recognizing those who've been in the field for long, but it also begins to enlighten the public so that we should begin to look in our own spaces of what is this in our backyards. It's something of value, but we didn't even pay attention to that.
True.
Now, Saint Gobain, of course, it being a French company, which has got no bearing to my background of study, like anyone else who took the initiative, they had advanced their technology. And of course, as a company, they're looking for markets. But how do you enter markets? And this is the anthropology and the culture of business and of engaging comes in. You need to fuse yourself and understand the people wherein you want to operate.
Sure.
Right. They want to operate in Africa. They may be already operating in Africa, but what is their entry point? Is to understand the people who perhaps use their products or promote their products, and last but not least, the people who are going to benefit from those products.
Truly.
Now that's where the anthropology comes in, and even in the choice of materials and etc. It may not be Saint Gobain only, but it is bringing attention to the people that when you build something, look at what you're using and why you're using it. What history does it have, right?
And the space it's in.
And the space in
and
it.
where it will live.
And where it's going to land. And of course, where it's going to land is the future impact on the generations to come.
True.
I mean, recently we've had some Rose Must Fall and all these structures which were deemed to be colonial to be taken down. It may be correct. But of course, it's incorrect because that's where you are erasing the memory.
Exactly.
You are erasing the reference points. Nothing is going to be better if there's no point where you can reference it to.
Exactly.
Right. So The Africa Architecture Awards, they've got that vein that says, let's do it together, but for the benefit of all,
Sure.
right? But why the continent of Africa? And of course, for lack of better expression, it's one continent which has got all the resources we need. It's one of the wealthiest parts of the world, but again, it presents itself as the most of the poorest because it has been exploited, and all materials have left Africa, but they come back at a high price.
Yes, up to 1,000%.
That which the very same people who owns those resources cannot even afford them.
Sure.
But then architecture is trying to refocus the thinking of the people that value what you have. It could be how small. Architecture is not about big buildings. It's about the impact that which it has on the people.
Sure.
Right. So this Pan-African Awards program, it's gunning for that because the entries are for everyone else but who has done work in Africa.
Okay.
That's where they highlight it.
So it is not necessarily firms of African origin, but it is firms that have done work on the continent.
They've done work in the continent,
Okay.
of course, yeah. And who did not just do the work and left. And many companies, regrettably, like my practice, wherever we do work, we tend to revisit the sites. We visit the site of the scene, of the crime. We did it, but we see how is it faring, right? And of course, we tend to be too possessive because we want to take control and begin to advise them that, please, you're not maintaining this properly, you're not looking after this properly.
Well, I think it goes back to your point about how you build buildings for people to live in, for it to be part of a community, for it to be part of a future generation. So when you come to a building back to visit it as you would visit an uncle or grandmother or whoever it is, you want to make sure that that piece has been looked after and used in the intended way.
Exactly.
I like it. I like that it's an ongoing organic process.
But again, it's a weakness because, it's... At times we tend to, there are times where I want to assimilate my life to like animals.
Yes.
A leopard or a lion will raise its cubs up to a certain point. As soon as they're able to feed themselves, it lets go.
Yes.
But then buildings and architecture and the built environment is never the same. It's not in the same vein, right? Because the people that have been tasked to look after those buildings or maintain those buildings, they're not necessarily doing that.
Yes.
Because they're not the original people who conceptualized its use and how its lifespan, to what extent it should be prolonged.
Yes.
You understand? So it becomes a complex thing. But of course, we need to begin to divorce those by educating our own people of how to design effectively. By designing effectively is taking into consideration that the building needs to withstand the test of time. And what is time? It's all the influences, whether it's religious influences, political influences, and etc. So it should never change. It should continue serving the purpose.
Yes.
Right. As much as many years ago, I was looking at a site in Guinea, which was a heritage site, and South Africans were involved in that.
Okay.
But the site itself, because it was based in a military base, the whole process was driven by the militia, the generals and etc. Right? And I warned them at the meeting. I said, but we don't have people from the community here. We don't have the people who made it possible or necessary that you should have a military base.
Exactly.
Where are the mothers of these soldiers that you housed here? Where are the educators of these soldiers here? And there was a university just a block away, right? And it worked out well because the meeting got adjourned at that moment. And I told them that the country where I come from, gender equity is critical.
Sure.
In anything that you decide, you don't decide on your own. And not only that, even the cultural equity, because you need to begin to look at everyone else who's going to be influenced or affected by your decisions.
Exactly. And a building is a huge disruption.
Exactly.
From the building phase to the occupation to even whenever you decide to demolish it, the lifespan is quite...
Now, what happened in that meeting, when the meeting was adjourned for lunch, when we got back, now there were other genders, there were other females, officers in the meeting, and some people from the community, and there was a professor from the university, which I really appreciated. But I'd warned them. When I warned them, I said, if you don't get custodians for this project, in the event of a change of administration, this project will be gone. Lo and behold, A month later, there was a coup in that country. Everything ground to a halt because the communities and everyone else were not involved.
True. And that is where, again, the nexus between the sociology and the anthropology has to exist.
It needs to be married into the development of any sort, particularly if it's a built environment. Because the first thing when there's a change in the country, people bend down buildings and everything else.
And also because, buildings seem to be very intrinsically linked to the identity of a country. So for you, you just look at how any terrorist organization always goes for the administration building, the seats of government, and they go for iconic buildings. So, heaven forbid, touch wood, but, the Statue of Liberty, she's going out first. Capitol Hill, she's going out first. The White House, she's going out first. Eiffel Tower, that's going. And it's always linked to those sort of markers of an administration.
Absolutely. But then, in good design, that which the Pan-African Architects Award is seeking, is to go beyond that, so that there should be a protection veil in anything that has been designed. People, generations to come, should begin to appreciate it, irrespective who the initiators were.
The builders.
Exactly.
Yes.
This is Trans Africa Radio.